century, Southern California has taken water from Owens Lake in Inyo County, but the record runoff from our winter storms could cause catastrophic damage to the aqueduct and the surrounding areas.
The fact of the matter is we do have rights to water there, and we'll continue to do that in the long term. The question is how we export.
For nearly a century, this corner of California was the most poisonous ground in the United States. 100 square miles of toxic salt flat that hurled 80,000 tons of dust into the air every year and made the people downwind sick just for breathing. By every rule of nature, it should have stayed a lifeless wasteland forever. Instead, something almost unbelievable happened. Today, that same poisoned earth is a thriving ecosystem, teeming with more life than it has held in 100 years. And the reason it came back is so strange, no one ever planned for it. To understand how a place this poisonous could possibly come back to life, you have to go back 800,000 years. The inland sea.
We continue to pump, we continue to divert water. At what cost is that coming?
Owens Lake held water for 800,000 years. Before 1913, it was a saline inland sea spread across 100 square miles at the foot of the Sierra Nevada, never more than about 50 feet deep, but vast. And here's the part that sounds invented. It was big enough to run steamships. During the silver boom of the 1870s, an 85-foot steamboat called the Bessie Brady hauled 30-ton loads of silver bullion from the Cerro Gordo mines across the open water to the freight depots on the far shore.
The Owens Valley is a place where Los Angeles went 100 years ago as they outgrew their own water resources locally.
Towns grew along the banks. Keeler, on the eastern edge, had 5,000 people. Birds settled on the surface by the hundreds of thousands. If you had stood on that shoreline and someone told you the whole lake would be bone dry inside a single lifetime, you would have laughed. You should not have. 200 miles south, the thing that would drain it was already being poured in concrete. The Great Diversion. The man who emptied the lake was William Mulholland, the engineer behind the Los Angeles Aqueduct. Finished in 1913, it ran 233 miles south to feed a city that could not stop growing, and to fill it, the project captured the Owens River, the lake's primary and almost only source, and turned the water south. A lake with no backup supply has only one fate. With its inflow cut, Owens began to shrink, pulling back from its own shoreline a little more every year, leaving wide rings of cracked clay where water used to be. The lakefront towns watched the water retreat from their docks and never return. By 1926, just 13 years after the diversion began, the entire lake was gone.
Mulholland came into the country or surveyed it and said, oh, this is a lot of water we could use in LA.
800,000 years to fill, 13 to empty. And then the ground it left behind started doing something nobody saw coming. The poison factory. Here is the part nobody mentions when they tell this story. What the water left behind was not ordinary dirt. It was a machine for manufacturing poison, and the reason comes down to chemistry. Most dry salt flats are basically table salt, sodium chloride, the same stuff coating the Bonneville salt flats in Utah, which dries into a crust so hard you can race cars across it. Owens is different in a way that turns out to matter enormously. The minerals concentrated here over 800,000 years of evaporation are mostly sodium carbonate and sodium sulfate, the chemical signature of the Sierra granite that weathered into this basin. Those salts do not lock into a hard shell. They crystallize into a soft, fluffy powder that sits on the ground like spilled flour, waiting for wind. And the lake bed never stops making more of it. The water table sits less than 10 feet down, and groundwater wicks up through the clay constantly, the same way water climbs a paper towel. It reaches the surface, evaporates in the desert heat, and leaves a fresh layer of powder behind. In winter, the sulfate crystals swell with moisture and crack the clay apart from the inside. In summer, they dry and collapse into dust. Every year, the same cycle. The surface never gets to settle. Then, the wind arrives, and the geography turns it into a weapon. The lake sits in a deep trough between two mountain walls, the 14,000-foot Sierra Nevada on one side, the 11,000-foot Inyo Range on the other, and wind funneled through that gap accelerates like air through a nozzle. When it slams into the powder, heavier sand grains bounce along the surface and smash the soft crust, and every impact throws up a cloud of particles 10 times finer than a human hair. That dust is loaded with arsenic, cadmium, and nickel, heavy metals that spent hundreds of thousands of years concentrating in this basin. And in 2001, this machine produced a number nobody thought was possible. Air monitors in the valley recorded 20,750 micrograms of dust per cubic meter. The federal safety limit is 150. That reading was roughly 140 times the legal limit, the single worst particulate concentration ever logged anywhere in the United States. And it was no freak event. The sky goes brown in minutes, the wall of the Sierra simply erased, the air turning to grit you can taste, every breath pulling arsenic-laced powder into your chest. 80,000 tons of poison thrown into the air every single year, and 40,000 people live directly downwind. 40,000 downwind. For the people in the Owens Valley, that dust was not a statistic. It was weather. The storms rolled in like fog, and locals named them the Keeler Fogs, after the town that once had 5,000 people on the lakeshore and now sat directly in the line of fire. When the fogs came, the emergency rooms filled with asthma attacks and respiratory failures, because this was not pollen. It was metal-laced powder, fine enough to slip past your body's defenses and bury itself in your lungs. People sealed their houses and ran hospital-grade air filters just to breathe indoors.
What I see as an ideal approach to the Owens Lake problem is doing something, looking at how lake in this state would heal itself.
Picture one woman in that valley standing at her window on a bad day, watching the mountains disappear behind a brown wall rolling in off the lake bed, knowing what it will do to her if it gets inside. So she does the math most people never have to. $8,000 on custom double-pane glass, sealed tight, not against the cold, not against the rain, but against the ground outside her own front door. It went far beyond private homes. On Highway 395, the main road down the valley, the storms dropped visibility to nothing and caused chain reaction pileups. 90 miles south, the U.S. Navy's weapons testing base at China Lake had to scrub flight operations again and again, each cancellation costing as much as $50,000, because the grit could score jet turbines and blind targeting sensors. That was the Wasteland, real, poisonous, and nearly a century old. Which makes what happens next almost impossible to believe. One quick thing before the turn. If you were leaning in right now, wondering how a dead poison lake bed becomes anything but a dead poison lake bed, that is exactly the kind of chain reaction this channel exists to chase. One decision upstream, setting off consequences nobody downstream ever agreed to. Subscribe and stay with me, because this chain is about to take a turn you will not see coming. The Reckoning. For decades, nothing was done, and the reason was the law. The agency draining the water, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, held rights that predated modern environmental rules by decades. The diversion had been legal when it started, and the city refused to take responsibility for what the dry lake bed was doing to the people around it. Why would it? The water rights were old and solid, the people in the valley were few, and they were a long way from anyone with power. For most of the 20th century, that math held, and the dust kept blowing, while the people downwind simply absorbed it. Then a man named Ted Shade found a lever. Shade was the county's air pollution officer, the person whose job was to answer for that record-shattering reading, and he went back through the statutes looking for any legal handle a small county air district could use against the most powerful water agency in the American West. And he found one. Buried in California, law was a statute that let his district hold the city financially liable for pollution caused by its historical water diversions, even diversions made long before the air rules existed. What that statute did was attach a price tag to the dust and route the bill straight back to the agency that created it. Suddenly, for the first time, doing nothing was the expensive option. Shade forced the fight, and the fight was brutal and long. He was one official from a thinly populated county standing across the table from a city of millions and its lawyers, outgunned in every way that usually decides these things. And he did not blink. In 1998, the Department of Water and Power signed a binding agreement accepting full financial and operational responsibility for the dust. Construction began in 2000, but the city kept swinging even as the bulldozers moved, challenging the mandate in federal court for more than a decade, until in 2012, a judge threw the lawsuit out entirely and ended the argument for good.
We had the most severe 5-year drought on record from 2012 to 2016.
The cure would cost $2.1 billion. And here is the twist that makes the whole story turn. The only thing that could fix the dust was the exact thing they had drained the lake to steal: water. The cure was water. Sit with the irony for a second. They killed the lake by taking its water. The only way to stop it from poisoning everyone downwind was to give some of that water back. Not enough to refill it, not to restore it, just enough to hold the powder down. The same resource that had built Los Angeles now had to be partly surrendered back to the desert it was taken from, by court order, forever. No one involved saw it as anything but a cost. Starting in 2000, the Department of Water and Power built the largest single-source dust control project in North American history. 3 methods running at once across 49 square miles of toxic lake bed. Try to picture the scale of that. Nearly 50 square miles, every acre of it engineered, leveled, plumbed, and monitored, a construction site the size of a small city laid out on the floor of a dead lake, all of it built to chase a single pollutant out of the air. The main weapon was water itself. Flows pulled from the Los Angeles aqueduct, the very channel that emptied the lake, were spread back across the playa in thin sheets, pooling behind thousands of low earthen berms that carved the surface into a grid of shallow cells. Keep about 75% of the surface wet through dust season, and the powdery crust cannot form. No crust, nothing for the wind to tear apart. Where flooding was not practical, crews planted salt grass, a native species tough enough to live in soil more than twice as salty as seawater, across laser-leveled blocks and watered in careful pulses. Think about what that plant is doing. Its roots knit the loose surface together, and its dense mat of stalks kills the wind speed right at ground level and traps blowing sand before it can launch more dust. And where even that would not work, they laid a 4-inch blanket of coarse gravel over a fabric membrane to cut the surface off from the groundwater entirely. No moisture wicking up top, no salt crystallizing, no dust. But nothing grows on gravel either. It is sterile ground by design, and that detail is going to matter enormously before this story is over. Here is what matters about all of it. Not one piece was built to create life. Every method was engineered to hit a single number, 99% dust control, and by 2018, they had beaten it. Peak dust crashed from that record 20,750, down to 728. Days over the federal limit dropped from 49 a year to 8, a 96.5% cut in peak pollution across nearly 50 square miles. For the first time in living memory, the air over the valley was almost clean. By every measure that anyone had set out to hit, the project was a complete and total success.
The 2016-2017 water year was literally the wettest year on record.
And that should have been the end of the story. And out in those shallow flood cells, the maintenance crews were starting to see things they could not explain. Life returns. They had come out to check water levels and berms, ordinary maintenance on an industrial site, the kind of work where nothing is supposed to surprise you. And they kept finding things that had no business being there. Picture one of them crouching at the edge of a flood cell that exists for one purpose, to keep poison out of the air, and finding green shoots pushing up through clay that has been sterile since before his grandfather was born. Plants nobody planted, insects nobody had seen in the valley, and then, one season, birds, a few at first, then flocks, then thousands, dropping out of the sky onto cells built for no reason other than dust. These were not biologists running an experiment. They were utility crews watching a dead place wake up under their boots, with no idea why. Think about how strange that is from where those crews were standing. A lake bed that had been biologically dead for the better part of a century was coming back to life inside its very first wet season. The engineering was aimed at the air. Quietly, on the ground, it was building something else. Here is the mechanism, because it is beautiful. When the shallow water settled over the alkaline clay, it created something that had not existed here since 1926, a gradient. Near the inflow pipes, the water ran nearly fresh. Further out, where it mixed with the ancient salt locked in the clay, the salinity climbed. And in the band where the concentration landed between 25 and 75 grams per liter, a narrow chemical sweet spot, conditions turned out to be perfect for explosive blooms of algae. Think about that for a second. The exact mineral load that made this lake bed one of the most hostile surfaces in North America became, at the right dilution, the perfect nursery. Not in patches, across square miles. That algae fed the next link in a chain no one designed. Alkali flies, an insect built for exactly this salty, mineral-heavy water, moved in almost instantly. The same chemistry that made this place lethal to ordinary life was the chemistry the alkali fly thrives in. And with square miles of algae to graze, the population detonated. Their larvae fed on the mats, the adults rose in clouds along every waterline. A wall of protein sitting right at the edge of the water, more concentrated food than almost anywhere else for hundreds of miles in any direction. And that finally summoned something with wings. The birds came.
What is our right for the future? Because it's difficult to build a future when there's question marks about water, which is life.
Run a line straight up from this valley and you hit the Pacific Flyway, a migration corridor that stretches from the Arctic all the way to South America. For shorebirds flying the 4,000-mile route twice a year, the desert crossing here is the worst stretch of the whole trip. Almost no water, almost no food, almost nowhere to land. And here is the thing that gives this its weight. Before 1913, Owens Lake had been one of the great refueling stops on that flyway. Picture what losing it actually meant. A bird the size of your hand, halfway through a journey from the Arctic to South America, hits the desert and finds the one reliable place to drink and feed simply gone. Dry clay where a lake used to be. For generations they had to fly that gap on whatever reserves they were carrying, with nowhere to come down. Some did not make it. Now, out of nowhere, there was water again, warm, shallow, and boiling with flies, sitting in the exact spot their ancestors had relied on for thousands of years. They found it almost instantly, as if the route had never forgotten. American avocets with their slender upturned bills, black-necked stilts on impossibly thin legs, white-faced ibis, western sandpipers by the tens of thousands, eared grebes riding the brine pools. They poured down onto the grid and they kept coming, season after season, in numbers that climbed instead of leveling off, until a place that had been a byword for poison was hosting one of the great bird gatherings of the American West. And here's the detail that makes engineers shake their heads. Those thousands of low berms, built purely to control where water drained, were accidentally manufacturing the one thing a feeding shorebird needs most: shoreline. Shallow edges where water meets mud, miles and miles of it. The grid produced roughly 3 times more of that edge habitat than the original natural lake ever had. The shape was human. What lived inside it was not. In April 2013, the Eastern Sierra Audubon Society surveyed the whole site in a single day. Imagine being one of the counters that morning, raising your binoculars over a grid that a water utility built to suppress dust, and trying to keep up with the sheer number of birds moving across it. The count came back at 115,000 birds, including more than 64,000 shorebirds across 20 species, feeding and resting on an industrial dust control grid. From the air, it looks like a circuit board pressed into the desert, all rectangles and straight edges. From the ground, with thousands of avocets wheeling overhead and the Sierra filling the western sky, it looks like exactly what the lake had been trying to become from the second water touched it. And the birds were not just passing through.
We began to have thousands and thousands of more birds than we had ever seen at Owens.
An accidental oasis. The recognition came fast, and it came from people who had no stake in flattering a water utility. The National Audubon Society named Owens Lake a nationally significant important bird area. In 2018, it was inducted into the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, an international designation reserved for places that support more than 100,000 shorebirds a year. That is the same lake bed that, 2 decades earlier, had posted the worst air quality reading in the history of the country. The most poisoned ground in America had quietly become one of the most important bird sites on the continent. But here is the part that changed everything. The birds did not just stop to rest, they stayed to nest. The western snowy plover, a California species of special concern, began breeding on the lake bed, 600 to 700 adults every year. That is the single largest snowy plover nesting population in the entire state, raising chicks on an industrial dust grid, a water utility built under court order. A bird the state is fighting to keep from disappearing chose, of all the places in California, the most poisoned ground in the country to raise the next generation. And nesting changes the law. There is a difference between a place birds pass through and a place they raise their young. A stopover can be abandoned the moment conditions shift. A breeding ground cannot, not without losing a generation. So when the plovers nested, California's Fish and Wildlife Agency stepped in and asserted jurisdiction over the whole site. The Department of Water and Power is now legally required to keep at least 1,000 acres as shorebird habitat and to sustain a baseline of at least 272 nesting snowy plovers, no matter which dust control method it uses on the surrounding ground. Read that back. A program built to satisfy clean air law is now bound by wildlife conservation law that did not even exist when the first water hit the playa. The utility set out to solve an air pollution problem and accidentally created a protected wildlife refuge it is now legally obligated to defend in perpetuity, whether it wants to or not. From 80,000 tons of airborne poison a year to 115,000 birds in a single spring day.
So when you think about it, this bird is traveling between 5,000 and 10,000 miles every year. They have to have places to stop on those pathways.
From the worst dust reading in American history to an internationally protected bird reserve. Every link in that chain, algae to flies to birds to binding legal mandate, hangs on one thing, and that one thing is running out. A fragile bargain. Here is the cruel part, the turn that makes this more than a feel-good story. The shallow flood zones that feed the algae, the flies, and the birds swallow up to 51% of all the fresh water the Department of Water and Power has in the Owens Valley during drought years. More than half the city's water in the basin, spread thin across a desert to hold down dust. So the city is doing the rational thing. It is converting flood zones over to the waterless methods, the gravel blankets and the mechanical tillage, to cut that consumption roughly in half. And here is the trap. Those waterless methods work. They control the dust just as well, and they barely sip water. But nothing lives on gravel, so every acre that flips from shallow water to dry control solves the city's problem and erases the bird's habitat in the very same stroke. Let that sink in. The oasis is not dying from neglect. It is threatened precisely because the dust project is succeeding, and success means using less water. And the squeeze is tightening from above. The Sierra snowpack that feeds both the aqueduct and the ponds is shrinking. The basin is warming. Evaporation is speeding up. The water the oasis needs is the same water the city needs, pulled from a source that gets smaller every year. 2 claimants, 1 shrinking supply, and 115,000 birds with no idea their feeding ground is a line item in a water budget. The single most astonishing fact in this whole $2.1 billion story is how fast the life came back. Algae in weeks, flies in months, birds in the very first season. The lake bed was never dead at all. It was only waiting. Nobody wrote a restoration plan. Nobody released wildlife. Nobody drew this food web on a blueprint. The desert just needed the surface wet, and it built everything else itself.
The entire valley was a garden. And so as you spread the water, your garden grew. All the plants, animals, bugs, everything.
One intervention aimed at nothing but dust, and the cascade did the rest. Algae to flies to birds to a legal mandate that now protects them all. The lake held water for 800,000 years. It was drained in 13. And the oasis that rose in its place survives only because a city keeps paying for water it is, at the same time, trying to stop using. Everything depends on a balance that is actively being dismantled, acre by acre, by the very success of the project that created it. Whether the snowy plovers keep nesting on the most poisoned ground in American history comes down to one open question: whether the water keeps coming. If a chain reaction like that grabs you, one fix dropped at exactly the right point, unleashing consequences nobody intended. That is the whole reason this channel exists. So, subscribe, and you will not miss the next one. And I want to know what you think, because there is no clean answer here. Tell me down in the comments, should the city keep flooding the lake bed for the birds, or save the water for the people downstream? I will see you on the next one.